Hello, and welcome back to Through the CSI Lens Behind the Yellow Tape. I'm Christina Brakeman, and of course, I'm going to be your host for this next episode. So we are in season 2, and this is officially episode 10. So thank you for hanging with us. We did take the month of July off, which was a much needed break. So thank you for hanging with us still and showing back up. I can't, express my appreciation enough. Would love it if you could follow us on Facebook, Instagram, share it with your family, friends, your coworkers, anybody who's interested in crime scene forensics work, who loves all the crime scene shows, forensic shows, or maybe someone who's interested in getting into this profession or even attending school for this. So they might be able to take up a couple, tidbits from me that will be helpful as they navigate that part of their life. But yeah, I'm excited to be back. And so, for the most part, I've kind of talked about my history, how I got into crime scene work, talked a little bit about my training, my education, and then went back and kind of told you of some cases that I recall during my profession as a CSI that kind of left a lasting impression. Most of them were big scenes, what I would consider bigger scenes. So not like your typical burglaries or armed robberies, things like that. Those are kind of, for lack of a better term, they're kind of the run-of-the-mill crime scenes. We get those every day, and there's not too much difference between them as far as the response and the work. And the small details might be a little bit different, but that doesn't mean that those cases aren't just as important, right? Because every case is important. Every case has a victim. Every case has a family member or a coworker. So there's always somebody who's going to be directly impacted in a negative way. So as a new CSI, that was one thing. I mean, I guess I never really struggled with that, is where the priority was. Even though you're taught in your training and how your unit usually navigates, there are certain calls that take higher priority than other calls. Same thing as a police officer, right? They respond to calls that are in progress, life-threatening calls, that type of thing. Those are the most important things. Officers are going to get pulled from those scenes typically, and those are the ones they're going to respond to. And then you have ones that are not in progress, that are delayed. There's no injury, there's no suspect in the scene, and those are going to be delayed, and officers will come as their staffing and time allows them. So crime scene is similar in that nature, but we typically always respond after the fact. So after police have been there, paramedics, fire, somebody's been transported, whether it be for medical or being taken down to the station for further questioning. So we're kind of the aftermath of all the things. But so for this particular episode, I wanted to talk specifically about calls that you don't always see on the news, the calls in between the headlines that really help you hone in and craft your skill and your knowledge, and they'll still challenge you, but maybe in different ways. So as I said, equally as important, definitely important to shape you as far as who you are as a CSI, and it impacts your community, right? All crime will impact your community at some level. So talking about the last episode, I talked a little bit about traffic investigations and some of my takeaways from working those scenes. And so my unit responded to traffic collisions, and a lot of times you'll hear them called traffic accidents. And I went into that difference between collision and accident and what I learned in school and what I learned in the field, but that's not relative right now. But so not every time when you go to your traffic collisions is there going to be a detective, a traffic investigator or detective that's going to come out and respond to that scene. It really just depends on your agency, your policies, and then the nature of the collision, right? Did somebody die? Is there serious property damage? Was it a hit and run? Is there somebody impaired? So those things are probably going to shape your response. But one thing I want you to take away from that episode is that not every detective will take the time to educate you, because that's not their job, right? Your job is to be informed when you show up, but you can't know everything about all the things. If that was the case, we wouldn't need anybody else's help. But I was fortunate enough early on in my career that I worked alongside, a traffic investigator who was super knowledgeable, who was willing and took the time and effort to kind of walk through scenes with me and kind of educate me on the things he saw, why he saw them that way, how physics became involved. And he was fascinating to work with. And, honestly, when he retired, it was a huge loss for our agency, because he's taking with him all that knowledge and experience and expertise. And you lose that when those people leave. So my takeaway is for you to know that not every detective is going to be that way. So my suggestion would be try to learn as much as you can, ask as many questions as you can without being annoying, document everything, because you never know, especially on accident scenes or collision scenes, you just don't know what's going to be relative and what isn't. It's not always as cut and dry as like a homicide or a robbery or something like that. So document everything, pay attention to everything around you, including your flow of traffic lights, how they're functioning, signs in the road, speed limits, construction signs, what kind of obstructions are present that may have caused the collision or contributed to the collision, construction zones, debris, condition of the roadway, weather, was it raining, was it hot and sunny, was it snowing, was it misting? All those things are important for you to document when you do those type of collisions or accident scenes. So again, if you can find somebody who you respond to accident scenes with on a regular basis, ask them questions, ask them to take you with them along the scene and point things out to you. That's what they're experts in traffic collision. That's what their training is. That's what their education is. That's what their experience is. So learn everything you can. And I would recommend you do that with every type of discipline, if it's homicides or just death investigations in general. Work alongside the death investigator, whomever responds to your death scenes, and just ask questions. And what is it that they're seeing on the body? Or what are they seeing based on the color, or the condition, or the clothing, or the drugs, or the alcohol, or the environment? Ask those questions so that when you respond to those scenes, you have that knowledge and you have some idea of what may have taken place at that scene to contribute to either the loss of property, the collision, the death, the injury, whatever it was. So be curious. You're never going to know everything. You don't know everything. Humble yourself, because when you don't, that's when you make mistakes. We don't work on assumptions, right? Some assuming, we know what that does. And you do not want to be that person. So this episode, I just thought we would just kind of talk about some things that don't really get discussed much in crime scene work. I mean, we've all watched CSI shows, forensic shows, and very rarely do they talk about testifying in court. And I know I've talked about this briefly in the past, but this is one of the things I wanted to mention, because, the first time you testify, it's going to be nerve-wracking every time you testify, first of all. But the first time is especially nerve-wracking. Doesn't matter if you're at city court, if you're going down to superior court, or if you're testifying federally. I was just getting ready to testify for a federal case where, believe it or not, so I'll just bring this in. I want to say this was probably 6-7 years ago. So it's been a long time coming. But we had somebody die. It was an overdose. He took fentanyl. And there was a time when our agency decided, when you go to these death investigations and an overdose is suspected, we want you to collect the drugs, obviously, because they want to test those, but also collect their cell phones, because they want to try to trace who is selling these drugs. So in this federal case that I was going to have to testify to, which I thankfully didn't have to, but they actually were able to prosecute somebody successfully for selling the fentanyl that killed this guy. And it was a full circle moment for sure, because when they started talking about that policy, I'm like, my normal self is like, yeah, right. Like they're ever going to track down who's selling these drugs and hold them accountable. How are they going to know that these drugs that they took came from that person or that source? Obviously, I don't know everything that happens in the background on that end, but I just was kind of skeptical and really didn't think anything of it. But every time I went to an OD scene, I always collected the cell phone if it was there, just because that's what they wanted us to do, right? So it was a pretty full circle moment. Even though it took years for them to prosecute this guy, they actually did, and they were successful, and he was sent to federal prison for providing drugs that killed this guy. So anyway, but having to testify in federal court is even more nerve-wracking. But it's a very set in stone. It's a very structured for the most part. I mean, obviously, there's going to be times in court where things, take longer than they have to, or they're having a hard time getting a witness to testify, or they have to reschedule you, or they run out of time. All those things happen. Like I remember one day I sat in court for 8 hours and I never got to testify. So they had me come back the next day. So you're kind of at the mercy of the court, but it is pretty well structured. So that is the advantage to that. But I just remember, anytime I testified in court, but especially that first time, how nervous I was. And then that first time I testified in court, they had somebody come in from my crime lab and, basically monitor my testimony and critique me so they could give me feedback on what I could do in the future to make my testimony better. But I was super nervous. And I remember one time when I was testifying, I thought I turned my phone ringer off or down. I don't know. Something happened where right in the middle of testimony, my phone starts ringing. So the whole court's quiet and I'm testifying. And all of a sudden we hear a cell phone. And I know it's me because it's my ringtone. And I was just like, everybody's like trying to find out which phone it was. And the prosecutor's like, do you want me to shut the phone off? I felt horrible. I mean, it's like, how unprofessional is that for your phone to go off? It definitely wasn't intentional. So if you do go to testify to court, just power your phone down completely. Just don't even risk it. You want to take very little up on the stand with you. I kept those items on the prosecutor's desk. But yeah, turn your cell phone off. You do not want your cell phone ringing or chiming or whatever it's going to do, or playing a ringtone you wouldn't want the court to hear for whatever reason. Yeah, that went off in court. So that was pretty embarrassing, but very, very nervous. Wasn't quite sure what the process is, even though in training you have like this mock court scene and you have a prosecutor, you have the defense, and they kind of go back and forth with you, and it kind of emulates what you may have to testify to. So basically, you're testifying to your background, your education, your training, any extended training, how many crime scenes you've worked, any certifications you have, any of those type of things. Sometimes they'll even get into were you reprimanded for anything that you did at a crime scene, blah, blah, blah. Do you have any personal connection to the crime, to the victims, the suspect, anything like that? Sometimes, depending on the defense attorney, they may get into that as well. I guarantee you, before you show up to court, they're looking at who you are, how long you've been with the agency, what your workstation history is like, what your personal life is like to some extent. They're going to be looking up all that stuff on you to try to use, if they can, to minimize or demean your reliability or your ability to work with not being biased. So don't think you're just showing up to court and they don't already know who you are. So very nervous. I remember thinking, okay, I had to make sure I had the right suit. And, because you always want to wear a suit to work or to court. You don't want to wear your uniform. You're supposed to appear unbiased, so you don't favor the police department. You're working for the city. You're representing the civilians, your community. So you want to try to separate yourself from that. You don't want to come off like you're biased in any way. So yeah, want to make sure you show up professional, groomed, not excessive jewelry, excessive makeup, crazy hair, just dress appropriately. I saw some people show up for court that wore things that would make you question their profession. I'll just say that. So again, you don't want to be that person either, but being very nervous, showing up there, trying to go through the process. Of course, you can't go into the courtroom until you're called as a witness. And then, you swear on the Bible and you go through that process, and then you take a seat. And typically your prosecutor will provide you a copy of your report. You can take one with you, but you want the prosecutor to know you have it. And you want to make sure you have permission to take it up on the stand with you. And some prosecutors are real strict about that. Some are not. Judges can be very strict about that. So just keep that in mind. And then if you don't bring your own, or they don't want you taking your own, they will provide you a copy of your report when you get up there to testify. And so I just remember, reviewing my report before court, reviewing the photographs and all the evidence so that I was familiar. And what will help you is if you have a defense interview and the prosecutor attends as well. So basically it's a recorded interview, and they talk about who you are, a little bit about your education, your history, and they talk about your role in this crime scene, what you did, what you didn't do. It's 15 to 20 minutes usually. Sometimes they'll do it in person. Sometimes they'll do it over the phone. It just depends. And then, so you kind of know where they're going as far as the defense, what their line of questioning may or may not be. And the prosecutor, if you have a good prosecutor, they should inform you as well if there's some issues with the case or what you can expect if they communicate well with you. So just going up there and remembering, you're sweating. I was sweating and my throat was dry, and I was kind of just so nervous and trying to remember to look at the jury, not the prosecutor, because I'm speaking to the jury, and remembering to use the words that a juror would understand, because they're not crime scene personnel or forensic trained. So they don't have the same knowledge or experience or expertise as I do. They're laypersons, so they do not have that knowledge. So remembering to speak in a way that they will understand what was done at the crime scene and why I took those actions. And so kind of like going back and forth between the prosecutor, defense attorney, and the jury, and they're looking at you and you're wondering, do they believe me? Am I articulating this correctly? And sometimes you'll get a defense attorney, even a prosecutor sometimes. I had some difficult prosecutors who will ask you the same question in different ways. And I don't know if they do this sometimes for clarification or because they want to try to catch you in a mistake or an error or something. So that can happen at times. And I remember, having to look back at my report because they were asking me specific things about what I did. And so, I forgot to ask the judge for permission to look at my report. And then I was reminded. So that was kind of embarrassing, obviously, because, my first time testifying. After that, I learned, Your Honor, may I review my report? And he or she would say yes. And I would look at my report, and then I would answer the question, making sure I looked to the jury. And then the defense attorney gets on. And then, if you work for an agency that has their own crime lab and you are an accredited crime lab, which means that you have set standards, policies, and procedures that have been implemented in your crime lab that dictates how you work and how you do your work, there's not going to be a whole lot that the defense attorney can raise as far as concerns. Usually where the concerns come into play is when it's left to patrol officers or detectives, because they're not held to the same scientific standards as I am. They have different policies and procedures, right? And because we're an accredited crime lab, we have strict policies and procedures that we have to abide by. So it helps us, one, prevent or avoid mistakes and errors. Not that they can't still happen, because they do, but they give you a very distinct guideline on how to do your job. And there's not a whole lot of gray in there. I mean, you can talk to people who will say there's gray area in forensics. Absolutely, there is. But when it comes to doing the job of a CSI, it is black and white. You shall, in your policies and procedures, it will be, you shall do this, you shall do that, meaning you have no choice but to do this specific task this specific way. And so it's your job to learn that, right, through your training and just experience. But yeah, testifying for the first time was very nerve-wracking. And I want to say I was on the stand for over an hour, maybe an hour and a half. So, you obviously need to take the stand before the other forensic personnel, the analysts, the forensic scientists can testify, because when you testify, you're going to be admitting evidence, the evidence that you collected. So basically what happens in this process, after you've given your testimony, they'll want to admit evidence as admissible. And so they'll hold up the piece of evidence you collected and be like, is this the piece of evidence you collected? It has your initials on it. Is it packaged by you? Does this look like your signature? Is it have a knife in it? Blah, blah, blah. And you'll say yes, and then the defense will either agree or disagree, and then the judge will decide if it's admissible, and then it gets entered into as evidence. And then they'll talk about photographs. So they'll bring up photographs, and also during your testimony to kind of drive home some of the testimony you're giving, because remember one thing as a CSI is that your judge, your prosecutor, your defense attorney, and your jurors are not familiar with the crime scene. They were not there. So it is your job to tell the story so that they can see that crime scene. They understand that crime scene. And one way to do that, other than your verbal testimony, is through your photographs. So we'll talk about photographs later on, but not on this episode, but in another episode. But taking good quality photographs will help just corroborate what you saw and what you did at your crime scene. But I think my feedback from that first one was, I'm trying to remember, just making sure I spoke clearly, I spoke up so that everybody could hear me, and that I maintained good eye contact with the jurors, and things like that. But I don't recall too much else. I do recall one time I testified in a city court, and one of the persons from forensics who was there, I was describing how we collect biological evidence, and I don't remember how I described a swab, but she gave me a suggestion to refer to as similar to a cotton swabs, because that visual representation is something that jurors will understand and can visually see. So you get good tips like that for future testimony. And I probably testified, I don't know, in my 15 years in crime scene work, I maybe testified 5 to 7 times a year. It really just depends. There are a lot of cases that plead, so you're never needed at court. So, but that first time you show up in court, you're going to be nervous. So dress professionally, dress conservatively, suit preference for sure, black, gray, navy, stay in the monochrome colors, nothing low cut. Make sure your hair looks decent. You're not crazy with the makeup and the jewelry or whatever it is that you may have. Turn your phone off. Bring as little personal possessions as you can. And remember, you cannot go in the courtroom until they summons you. You can't be there for the other testimony. The other thing I wanted to touch base with is realizing the importance of my role as a CSI. I mean, you would think that would be a given, right? That you've gone through this education and training and you have some experience and that would just come to you. But it's really not until you see the results of your work. And yes, when you go to court or you hear about a case that somebody pleads, you're like, okay, or you get a notification that your fingerprint that you process at the crime scene identifies someone, or the DNA that you swab or collected from the crime scene identifies somebody, or something like that. Obviously, you know that your work is getting results because they're identifying somebody. Now, whether or not they're a person of interest or a suspect or a victim, that's a whole nother conversation. But you know that your work matters. And one of the things that kept me in that field for so long is knowing that, because I don't think a lot of people can go to work every day and really say that. Yeah, all of our work is important to some extent, right? To keep the business running, or rendering healthcare to people, or educating, or whatever it is. But as a crime scene investigator, what you do is so important. You're impacting people's lives. You're giving victims an answer, a voice. You're giving solace to families who've lost a loved one, or a business that has been the victim of something that has been pretty substantial that's going to impact the quality of their business or being able to provide services to their customers, or even something in a residential setting. You're bringing peace and calm to that neighborhood when something happens that leaves them uneasy. Because I don't think, one thing that really can mess with your peace of mind is knowing that somebody comes in and violates your space, right? Violates your car, comes into your home, comes into your business, comes into your yard, and violates that area that you have deemed sacred and you're protective over. And when somebody who's not wanted comes into that area and violates you, it can be very problematic and really mess with your peace of mind, right? So CSI, we tend to kind of get shunned in forensics, I want to say, because we're not the ones doing the scientific work. We're not in the lab doing the analysis that gets the results. But I always like to remind people in this profession, it's because we go out to the field and we do the hard, dirty, emotional work that those people in the crime lab can actually do their work, because they're not coming out to the crime scene. Most of those people who are forensic personnel who work in a controlled lab, not all, but most, would not be able to do our job in the field every single day. And there's a reason for that, right? Just like I would not want to be in a crime lab in a laboratory setting every day. That is not for me. I would not like that. I would not do well with that. That's not for me. So we both have our place in forensics. But without you as the crime scene investigator, it's really hard to prove a case without forensic evidence. Ask any detective that. Doesn't matter what kind of forensic evidence it is. It could be digital forensic evidence. It could be, physical, any type of physical forensic evidence. So it could be circumstantial. It could be testimony. It could be anything. But your role as a CSI is important. And yeah, you can have police officers go out there and collect evidence, but I guarantee if they haven't had the training, they don't have the experience, and they don't have the education, they're not going to be as efficient as you. They're not going to get the results as you. There are exceptions to that. But for the most part, you as a CSI, you have an important role. You start the ball rolling. Your work makes a difference and makes it possible for everybody above you to do their work. For the forensic scientist to do the work, for their detective to do the work, for the prosecutor to do the work, and for the jurors to do the work. It starts with you. So don't ever let somebody make you feel like you are the black sheep of forensics. You're not. You are the foundation. You are the building blocks of forensics. You are what we build from. So your role is important. And so I don't think for me, when I initially started and worked for quite a few years, that was really relayed to me. We were kind of, like I said, the black sheep of the crime lab. We were in the basement. We were kind of an afterthought. Everything was about the forensic side, about the forensic scientists, and we were just kind of there. And we struggled for years because of that, I think. So don't let somebody tell you that your work isn't important, because it is. But for me, when did I see it? When did I stop thinking we were insignificant or not significant? I don't know that I ever felt that way. I just didn't truly see it. Like my eyes weren't really opened until I started to get more experience. And I started seeing evidence as more than just evidence, right? And I started seeing it more as the person behind it. Where did this evidence come from? Who did it belong to? Where did it belong to? What's the relevance of this? And it could be, like I said, physical evidence, or it could be a person, could be a body, So I realized probably within the first 3 to 4 years, okay, this is important. It's more than just going out and going through the motions of the job. It is about working to solve this crime in the most efficient and proficient way I can to assist forensic scientists and detectives, prosecutors, and the jury to solve this case and prosecute somebody successfully. So that's when I started realizing how important it is. And at that point, you start slowing down when you go to your crime scene. I mean, everybody's in such a hurry. I got to take the next call. I got to take the next call. And I will tell you that if you're in this profession, you are going to be feeling the weight of this all the time. You're going to have dispatch wanting to know if you can break and take a call. You're going to have your supervisor. I'm not kidding. Your supervisor will try to get you to break from your call before you're done. You will have lieutenants call you, sergeants call you, saying they need you to break from your scene because they have something more pressing. You're going to feel the burden from your coworkers that you need to keep up with them, that you need to take as many calls as them, that you need to be shagging calls left and right so that you are taking enough calls. It's almost like you're trying to justify your presence, that you've earned that job because you've taken so many calls. Matter of fact, in my unit, people who took the most calls every month were rewarded. Not the quality of the work you're doing, but how many calls you were taking every month. So that was a whole nother dynamic that happened in my unit. I remember I was on a homicide scene. No, it wasn't a homicide scene. Well, it was a homicide scene, but not traditional. It was an officer-involved shooting. And where I was, the agency I was from, we mostly worked homicides and officer-involved shootings by ourselves. I do know they have a different procedure now. Some new state laws have come into play, and so now that has changed. But I can only speak for my time when I was doing the work, so may not apply to you now. But typically, I would work those scenes by myself. If I was fortunate enough, I might get one extra person to come out and help with the officer side of it, and then I would work the scene or vice versa. But I remember I was on graveyards and we had officer-involved shooting, and I actually had another person out there. It was just the two of us working that night, and a lieutenant called me. This is an officer-involved shooting. One of the most important calls that I can take in my career is an officer-involved shooting. He called the unit cell phone number, and he asked me to break from my officer-involved shooting, to leave my homicide scene so that I could come and help them. Are you kidding me right now? It's like 3:00 in the morning. I'm dead ass tired. We're understaffed. I don't know if I've been to the bathroom or eaten. And I'm out here on this unfortunate incident that's happened because an officer had to take somebody's life. And if you've never been in that scene before, I don't recommend it. It's stressful. It's sad. I mean, somebody died and somebody had to take a life. So, and then you have somebody calling you when you're right in the middle of doing your work, trying to get you to break so that you could go handle some stupid ass call for them. I was like, you've got to be kidding me. So you're going to have that stress, the job, where they are going to want more and more and more and more and more from you. And, you're going to have to set some healthy boundaries there that are going to be acceptable because they will run you dry. Seriously. But again, talking about, the importance of crime scene work and evidence, that it's not just a beer bottle. It's not just a knife. It's not just a car. It's not just some soil or a bug or, miscellaneous hairs and fibers. Those are important. Those tell a story. Those allow you to corroborate what happened or what didn't happen. They link suspects to crimes and crimes to suspects and victims and vice versa. It's a linkage system that happens. So it's important that you see more than just what's in front of your eyes, that you understand and are able to interpret the relevance of that and what it means. It helps solve crimes. It supports, like I said, legal proceedings. It establishes that link between your crime, your suspect, your victim. And it ensures that evidence is handled properly, because when you go to testify, as I mentioned before, you want to make sure that you're following your policies and procedures, because if you're not, this is where this evidence handling is going to come into play. And if you recall, I told a story about a sexual assault and how the evidence was handled prior to my involvement, and the scrutiny and the anguish that caused those family members, and how it was made the case more difficult for the prosecutors. So your job is important, if not the most important job there is. So don't ever feel like what you do every day, the sacrifices you make every day, the hard work that you're putting in every day, the mental and physical toll this job takes on you every single day. Don't ever let somebody undermine that or make you feel like it's just a job. It's not just a job. It's important. And it impacts people. It impacts your community. It impacts your agency. It has a ripple effect. So again, you may not learn that in training. You may not learn that in the first couple of years, but it's something to keep in mind as you start to navigate and start to process these crime scenes and figure out a way for you to work them and work them effectively and proficiently, right? Evidence is important, and it's not just, again, what you're physically seeing. There's value in every single piece of evidence, and it ties back to a human. It ties back to a victim. It ties back to a victim's family. It ties to a suspect. It's important. So moving forward in your career, just remember that. And the last thing I'll say about that, it's not one piece of evidence. And this is what I teach my students. It's never one piece of evidence. And you watch CSI Miami, I don't even know if those shows are on anymore, or like Forensic Files or Crime Scene 360 or whatever the new crime scene shows are. It's never, they try to say, oh, it's the fingerprints, it's the blood. Are those highly valuable pieces of evidence? 100% without a doubt. Those are so valuable. But it should be the totality of the evidence. And what I mean by that is it shouldn't be just one thing that you're focusing on. You shouldn't go to a crime scene and say, oh, I got fingerprints. This is, I don't need to do anything else. I don't need to process anything else. I don't need to collect anything else because I have fingerprints, or I see what I think is blood or saliva or some other bodily fluid. I've got it in the bag. That, I'm telling you, that does not happen. Don't get into that mindset where you put all the value in one piece of physical evidence. It's the totality of the evidence. I like to refer my students back to the O.J. Simpson case. What did they do? They put all their ducks in a little bag. And what was that bag? DNA, fingerprints, DNA, fingerprints. And what happened in that case? They should have admitted the shoe prints. They should have, and they didn't. Don't know why, but it would have made a difference, I think, in how that case was tried. Just my 2 cents. But so it's always going to be the totality of the evidence. And when in doubt, collect it. You can't go back. When in doubt, photograph it, collect it. When in doubt, photograph it, collect it. You do not want to be somebody who has left something behind. And question why you did not do something. Oh my gosh, that is the hardest lesson to learn. And you do not want to learn when you're at court. You do not want your boss calling you into the office, asking you why you did or did not do something. When in doubt, collect it. Who cares? We call it what do we call the let's see, FTFO. Yeah, I won't use the F-bomb, but yeah, that's in there. So when in doubt, collect it, and just know that it's important. Every piece of evidence is important, and you never know which one is going to be the most valuable. So totality of the evidence. Another thing I want to talk about is some basically valuable lessons that I was taught from crime scenes. It's amazing how much you can learn about yourself and your abilities when you're in a situation like this that is traumatic. Sometimes it's hostile. Sometimes it's long, it's cold, it's hot, you're sick. All the things come into play. Or maybe you're even working with a coworker that you can't stand. All the dynamic. Or an officer. I had officers more than not. I remember this one officer. He must have been having a hard day. I'm just going to chalk it up to that. And when I think about that situation, I probably should have done more after the fact for him, because maybe he needed help or something was going on than I gave consideration to. Because we work with these people day in and day out. We know their personalities, we know their work ethic, we know the communication style. And so when somebody doesn't appear like themselves, pay attention. So that's my caveat for that. But I remember I showed up to the scene. I don't know what kind of scene it was. I want to say it was an assault, probably a domestic violence case. Somebody was injured, there was property damage. And so I had to go and photograph victim, suspect, had to go back to the jail and photograph the suspect and just photograph some property damage and some weapons. And I remember this ties into the pressure of the work and, knowing the important role that you have in the role of physical evidence. But I remember him being up on the second story of the apartment. And I'm like, I'll be back. I have to go get something. I can't remember what it was, but I needed something else to do my job in the apartment. And he goes, I remember him yelling at me, like yelling at the top of his voice. You don't need to do that. That's not necessary. That's going to take too much time. He was so angry and he was just yelling at me. And I just turned around and looked at him because it just threw me off. And I'm like, I just looked at him. I go, first of all, you don't tell me what to do. Second of all, you're not the boss. And 3, you don't know how to do my job, just like I don't do your job. So I'm going to go get what I need to do to process my crime scene and I'll be back. And I said, and if you want to continue this conversation, then we can do it after the crime scene has been processed. I was just like, what is going on? And then I had another scene where I was doing nighttime photos. And if you know anything about nighttime photos, they take a long time because it's nighttime photos. You got to use a tripod. You got to, use special lighting. It takes a while to do nighttime photography. And I remember the officer, he said to me, he goes, why does it take you guys so long to do photos at night? I mean, he was just so irritated that as soon as he saw me pull out the tripod, he was irritated. It just set him off. And I said, listen, I can do things the right way or I can do things the wrong way. Either way, I'm here to do a job. I said, if you don't want to be here, then you can find somebody else who can relieve you and they can stay here with me, right? But I'm going to do my job the way I was trained, the way best practices has taught me, the way my policies and procedures have advised me on. And if you don't like it, you can sit in your car and pout. But I'm going to do my job and you can keep your 2 cents to yourself. I was just like, you're making a stressful situation already more stressful on me because nighttime photography can be stressful, right? I happen to like doing nighttime photography, but it does take more time and consideration. And officers, maybe he had to go to the bathroom. Maybe he hadn't eaten all day. Maybe he got in a fight with his partner. Maybe he was pissed off at work. I don't know what his deal was, but I try not to take it personal. But I also don't let the stress or the weight or the pressure, the pressure of officers or even civilians like victims or trying to tell me what to do and how to do my job. Like, I know how to do my job. I know what's required to do my job and to do it efficiently. So that's what I'm going to do. The only caveat or deviation to that is if a sergeant says, you have so many minutes to do your job because other than that, I cannot ensure your safety. And I think out of all of the crime scenes I worked, that only happened one time. And literally, I deviated from my policies and procedures because of safety. But typically, I follow my policies and procedures, and that's what I'm going to do. And if they don't like it, too bad, don't call me out or have somebody come relieve you and they can stay out here with me. So, I look at it this way. They have a chance to catch up on paperwork. They can eat. They can get out of the heat or whatever. They don't have to answer another call for service. So they're having a little bit of downtime because they can sit in their squad car and do whatever they need to do. Make a personal phone call. I don't know, whatever that is. So I personally think that would be a good thing if I had to sit out a couple extra minutes while my CSI is doing what he or she needs to do. So anyway, the weight will come down on you at some point. But some of the valuable, again, lessons that I was taught from crime scene is, evidence is valuable, totality of the evidence. And if you don't recognize it as evidence, then it's not going to get collected and that could impact the case. So your job as a CSI is to be able to recognize evidence. It is not the officers. That is not their training. Yes, they will tell you, oh, this was used in the argument or the fight or the robbery, or this was damaged, or this is how entry was made or exit was made, or this was the car the suspect and victims were in. Yeah, they're going to tell you stuff like that. But it's your job as a CSI to go through that crime scene and look for things that are relative to that incident. And then if you're unsure, you ask that officer, hey, is this involved? I saw this, I noticed this, because he or she has a million other things they're doing on scene. They're not going through the whole scene and looking for physical evidence necessarily. And fire department sure in the heck isn't doing that. They destroy stuff, right? Because they're going in to render aid and rescue people. They're not worried about crime scene evidence. So your job, that is your job. Your job is to recognize it, to process it, to collect it, to package it, and submit it. Nobody else but you. So you better make sure you're taking time to walk through those crime scenes and be thorough and ask questions. Another thing is the quality of your work. You want to be known for quality work. And I will tell you that many times I would show up at a crime scene and I would have an officer or a sergeant or a detective say, I'm so glad it's you that's coming. I'm so glad I saw it was you coming, because they know that I am going to do quality work. However long that takes me to do it, I'm going to do it, but I'm also going to do it efficiently. And they know that. So you don't want to be known as the person who didn't do things because you were not asked, because I've seen that happen. Just because an officer didn't ask you to do something doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. That's a conversation you should be having with them. It's your job to know. Quality work, nothing replaces it. Quality work, good photographs, good processing, good observation skills, good note-taking, good report writing, all of those things, evidence processing are going to be important. So make sure you hone in on those skills and do your best with what you've been given, right? Another thing to think about is, like I said, the conversations that you have with people at the scene. So you're asking the who, what, when, where, why, how. If you're not asking the right questions, you're not going to receive the right information necessarily, which will impact your ability to process the crime scene efficiently. So an example I would have this, we had, and it wasn't a Dollar Tree, it was, I don't know, one of those Dollar Tree type stores, and they were robbed. And so somebody comes in the door, they go up to the customer counter, they have an exchange with an employee, they're trying to steal the cash register, they flee out the same door. And when I get there, I have this officer, he's a day shift officer, so if you know, you know, not the most forthcoming, he's kind of hard to get information from, it's almost like pulling teeth, not the most personable. Yeah, has been on for a long time. So you're already up against a difficult situation. So I go there. He tells me, guy comes in. He comes in this door. It's the only way in, only way out. Comes up to this counter, wants the money, tries to get the cash register. He wasn't able to get it. And then he flees out the door. Nobody's injured. I'm like, okay, great. So I go in there. I take a look, checking out the cash register. I mean, there was a whole line of cash registers. So maybe 8 cash register stations. So there's nothing, unique about this area. Nothing was damaged. He didn't leave anything behind. So nothing like that. So I'm thinking, I'm just going to do photographs. I'm going to do process for prints, even though I knew the surface of the counter wasn't really suitable for prints. But who knows, maybe I'll get lucky. They weren't able to look at the video. So I don't know if he was wearing gloves or not or anything like that. And so I start taking my photographs and start processing for prints, and it was on the inside of the cashier area. And about this time, an employee comes up to me, starts talking to me. And in that conversation, I was able to extract that the suspect jumped over the counter, tried to get the register, jumped back over the counter, and then fled. Well, the officer failed to tell me that. And why is that important? Well, there could be shoe prints on there. There could be full palm prints. Anything could be. There could be more forensic evidence on that small surface. But guess what had happened in the meantime? Employee came up to that area. So I learned a hard lesson. And he's like, hey, can I set this down right here? And I'm like, yeah, because to me, I was done in that area. Well, I found out afterwards, and after the employee had set something there, that the suspect had actually jumped the customer counter. He didn't walk around the customer counter. So then I was kind of pissed, because I was like, well, damn it, I should have known that, because, I could be looking for shoe prints. I could be using, depending on what I might have seen with oblique lighting. I mean, there's just whole things extra steps I probably would have done, which was a hard learning lesson. And so anyway, I finished processing the scene and I go back out. I'm like, dude, you got to tell me everything that's going on in these scenes. Like, I can only ask you so many questions, but if you're not telling me relevant information, it makes it really hard for me to do my job efficiently. He wasn't very receptive of that, but I'm like, I don't know what you don't tell me, and I can't just assume. So make sure you're informing the crime scene person that comes here. I shouldn't have to necessarily hear it from an employee. So that was a whole learning experience, having those conversations, talking to the employees if you get a chance, if there's somebody there who's willing to talk to you, who can talk to you, and then, making sure you're asking the right questions from the officer or detective or whomever, because many times when you go to a crime scene, it may not be the original officer who was at the scene. They may be relieved. So it could be a secondary, third officer that has responded and maybe wasn't there initially and doesn't really know all the information, because the primary officer has taken the suspect into custody or left with the victim. So they're not there to ask the questions. So it's just really important that you're getting as much information as you can so that you can process your crime scene thoroughly. And then the other valuable lesson I've learned is just the equipment. I mean, I know a lot of agencies are on strict budgets. I recognize that. And we were like that for a long time until we became accredited. And then we ended up, because we were accredited, we were eligible for grant funds, which grant funds we use towards equipment. But when you're using really outdated equipment, it makes it really hard to do your job, right? When your camera's super outdated, if your forensic light sources are outdated, if your powder, your brushes, your chemicals, all those things are outdated, your instrumentation's outdated, it does make it harder to do your job. So there's only so much control you have as a CSI on that. But you want to make sure you're reporting to your supervisor, hey, my camera's malfunctioning. Hey, this is malfunctioning. Hey, this isn't working. Oh, I need more of this, or I need this. Just keep that communication open with them so that you can do your job effectively and efficiently. I mean, I think I told you that story where both of my cameras broke at my crime scene, and I had actually gone to my supervisor previously and said, hey, my camera's not working properly. And he basically told me, too bad, everybody's having that problem, you're just going to have to use it. So I used it until it broke and it would no longer work. But making sure you have all your equipment out there, making sure it's working, making sure you're doing quality checks on your equipment so that you don't get out there and your batteries are not fully charged. I've done that too many times. Make sure you're charging your batteries. Make sure you have all the equipment you need. Make sure you don't forget things. Make sure your tripod is working. Make sure if there's any community equipment that you use, that you check it out, that you test it before you use it at your scene. You should have some kind of quality assurance measure or some kind of quality assurance that you should be doing, QA testing that you should be doing before you use it out in the field. And just making sure that you have what you need every shift and making sure that you leave your crime scenes with all of your equipment, because I've left equipment behind at crime scenes. It makes it really hard to go back and get. I've left evidence at crime scenes before. So I've talked about that in the past. Definitely a learning experience. So just making sure you have quality equipment. You're having those important conversations. Your work is quality work based off your training, your expertise, and your education. And then, knowing the value of evidence. All evidence is valuable. Not one piece of evidence is more important than the other. And what you don't collect, you can't analyze, you can't process, you can't make an ID from. So hopefully this episode was a little bit insightful for those of you, kind of give you more of an inside look at what CSI life is like and some of the dynamics you have to deal with that they don't necessarily talk about on the news or on TV shows. These are just those little gray areas that happen throughout your career. I'm sure there's a dozen more things that I could put into here, but these are the three things. Remembering the first time I testified in court, realizing the importance of my role as a CSI, and then obviously some valuable lessons that I learned from crime scene work in general. And, when I going back to realizing the importance of my role, and when I spoke about that case with the little girl in the closet, was a full circle moment, which you don't get a lot of those in this profession. But seeing that little girl was huge, because without all of us going out and working this scene, she may not be here today. She may not be thriving with a family and living her best life. I would have never been able to see her celebrating her birthday with the Disney characters and hair growing and she's walking and she's talking and she's wearing a Disney. I would have never seen that. So your job is important, just like everybody else. Don't let anybody diminish that or make you feel less because you're a CSI. And, yeah, my takeaway is that, not every call or scene is going to be memorable because it's the biggest or most horrific scene. There's plenty of those. Sometimes it's because of what it taught you about your work, the work that you do, and the people that were involved, and what it taught you about yourself. That's the biggest takeaway from, being a CSI. It's going to be a little bit different for everybody, and then you're going to have some similarities as well. So hopefully you enjoyed this episode and learned a little bit more about CSI work and forensics and how that all kind of plays in together, and how important it is for, everybody to kind of come together to get the results that we need in order to be able to prosecute a case. So if you enjoyed this episode through the CSI lens behind the yellow tape, the best way you can support us is by leaving a review, a quick rating. It helps more people find us, and it keeps me bringing you more straight from the crime scene. Make sure to hit follow and so you don't miss another episode. Until then, stay curious, and I'll see you behind the yellow tape.